Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the FPCJ press briefing today on the COP21, which will be held in Paris from November 30th to December 11th. Let me introduce to you today's briefers. From your right, Mr. Mitsumata Hiroki Mitsumata, Deputy Director General for Environmental Affairs of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. And Ambassador Atsuyuki Oike, Assistant Vice Minister, Director General for Global Issues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Mr. Takeshi Sekiya, Director, Low Carbon Society Promotion Office, Global Environmental Bureau, Ministry of the Environment. Today's briefing will be conducted in English only. Also, please make sure to turn your mobile phones to the silent mode, please. Now, Ambassador Oike, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And I would just like to talk about 2 points today. One point is what we are expecting, what we want to achieve in the context of the upcoming COP21 negotiations. That's the first point. Another point that I wanted to talk about is the announcement today of the Actions for Cool Earth version 2.0. This was determined this morning, and it was actually made public by the Prime Minister in the process of that particular meeting. Now, on the first point, you have some handouts with you, I believe, and those are the list of points to be discussed, negotiated in Paris. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the individual items, but I just prepared a series of items for discussions. Now, another paper talks about our position towards the COP21. Can I just start with this one? Our primary objective for this COP21 negotiations is to establish a fair and effective framework applicable to all parties. And then we have, several points related to that. The first point is that the contributions by both developing countries and developed countries in the light of national circumstances should be the key instrument of this particular agreement. In other words, this is to say that bifurcation between developed and developing should disappear. We need to have a single system with some flexibilities for vulnerable countries. That's the first point that I want to emphasize. The second point is building a system towards increasing ambition over time. This is a general theme, and for that reason, we have proposed, and all the developed countries proposed, European countries in particular proposed to have a very ambitious long-term target, as well as the mechanism to reach there. So that's the second point. And the third point is in fact contained in the same bullet, ensuring implementation of INDCs. Now, we have more than 160 countries which have already submitted their INDCs. INDCs, by the way, is intended nationally determined contributions, intended nationally determined contributions. This is in fact a plan to reduce emissions. Now, after submitting those INDCs, countries will need to explain in the future how they have implemented the measures listed in their own NDCs. So this is called a transparency mechanism, and this is one very important area for us. And finally, the global cooperation through market mechanism. Market mechanism is very important from our perspective. later, we will have Mr. Skiel, who is going to explain our efforts for joint credit mechanism. But in the current round of negotiations, perhaps it would be a little bit difficult for us to have a very clear system for market mechanism. There are a lot of disagreements on this, and perhaps it would be a bit too early for us to have a clear picture about this particular mechanism. So what we need is a kind of hook this time on which we can have this market mechanism at a later stage with more clear international rules, particularly to avoid double counting. So those are the positions that we have been promoting. And among those positions, if I have to choose one of them as a priority, it's the second item. Both developing countries and developed countries need to have a single system with flexibilities for vulnerable countries. You know, for developing countries, we can have some flexibilities. No, we don't dispute that. But nevertheless, we need to have a single system. And as you are aware, the fact that we have so many INDCs means that countries submitted their own INDCs in light of national circumstances. That means self-differentiation. So, you know, so this should be the principle in the years ahead. That's what I wanted to emphasize. You know, this is a very important point from our perspective. Now, talking about the overall points of negotiations, as you are aware, there are a number of disputed points. If you look at the left-hand side, you have an issue of legal bindingness. Well, I'm not getting into this, but this is a very serious issue. Now, as we understand it, in the context of negotiations, no country is saying that INDCs or NDCs should be legally bound. No more. But nonetheless, what kind of actions need to be legally bound is an issue still to be solved. For example, if you make it a legal obligation to implement your INDC, this might be the same as binding INDCs. You know, there is a legal argument to that effect. So we still need to tackle with the issue of legal bindingness on different fronts. The second item is differentiation. As you are aware, CBDR is a very much common framework. And this has been the case for quite some time in the context of climate change negotiations. But last year in Lima, we established a new formulation, CBDR, in light of different national circumstances. This should be the compromise. So, you know, differentiation and bifurcation are essentially the same. So this is the issue that we want to tackle. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, you know, the number 3 item there, pre-2020 action and support. Here we have a pathway towards mobilizing $100 billion. This is a commitment that the developed country made at the time of COP15, and later in the next year, in COP16, there was, you know, a COP decision to this effect. Now, developing countries are asking us to come up with a very clear picture as to how this objective, this commitment, is going to be achieved. That's the thing that we are working on, and today we made some announcement in this regard. I'll come to that point later. Now, even in the pre-2020 context, we still have an issue of increasing ambition or enhancing implementation. And this applies not only to mitigation, but also to support. Particularly, the developing countries are asking for support for their own actions, even in the pre-2020 context. So this is not going to be a Paris Agreement. This is not a part of it, but nevertheless, this is an important portion which would probably have a great deal of impact on the success or failure of negotiations. By the way, just to deviate, the co-chairs have about 10 facilitators. One of them happens to be a Japanese working with us, and she, in fact, she is a facilitator on this particular area. So we have a double responsibility for this issue. Now, going to the individual points, I'm not getting into details, but again, in the area of mitigation, we have a long-term goal. This is a level of ambition, and target year cycle kind of things, and transparency issue and market mechanism. And then moving on to the goal of adaptation, we have an issue of whether we're going to set up a global goal for adaptation or not. And also, we have an issue of loss and damage. I'm not quite sure if you know this loss and damage. Okay. Loss and damage, in short, is the position that developed countries have to compensate for the loss and damages caused by the climate change, because after all, developed countries are the ones who emitted a lot of CO2s and thus caused climate change, and therefore they need to compensate for the loss and damage. And this is an issue raised particularly by island states. And this is one of the difficult negotiation points. The principle is understandable, but nevertheless, the idea of having or admitting legal responsibility for the damages and losses is very difficult, as you can probably imagine. Now, we also have technology transfer issue, and we also have finance issue. And here in the finance issue, this is after 2020. And there's an issue of whether we should have a quantitative goal or not. And this is related to the issue of expansion of donor base. That means, not only the traditional donors, but also new donors like China, and also the private funds should be included in this category of donors. That's one point that we are saying. Let me just talk a little bit about the background to this. This year, we have 4 major international conferences, UN-related, starting with the Sendai Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, and then we went to Addis Ababa for Finance for Development Conference, and then in September, in the United Nations, we had Development Summit, which approved the 2030 Development Agenda. Now, throughout these conferences, there's a common theme. Let's try to change the system to match what it is now. In reality, the private money, particularly in the form of investment, is, in some calculations, more than 12 times bigger than ODA. That's UNCTAD, UNCTAD figure. By the way, the private investment includes both direct and indirect investment. But in any case, they say that investment is more than 12 times bigger than the ODA. And so when you talk about development, you have to take the private capital into consideration. So that same spirit has to be reflected in the climate change negotiations. And in the same way, the 2030 agenda is universally applicable. That means there is no differentiation between developing and developed. So the same spirit also has to be reflected in the context of climate change. So this finance issue is very hot at the moment, because we want to see the fundamental change in this finance section of the climate change agreement. But at the same time, we have to take care of the needs of vulnerable countries. That's why we might have to consider some specific target for those countries. Those are the major negotiation points. Finally, I would just like to touch on what our Prime Minister announced earlier today. And you have a handout here, this one. And perhaps this is, in a way, self-explanatory, so I'm not getting into details. But what was one very important element there is our support to developing countries. And there, our Prime Minister disclosed our plans to provide in 2020, in the year 2020, 1.3 trillion yen of public and private climate finance. This is in fact 1.3 times more from the current level. And this is a pledge that our Prime Minister made in the context of $100 billion that I explained before. This is our contribution to the efforts of other developed countries and multilateral development banks to achieve the $100 billion commitment. So this is a part of it. But at the same time, if you have a look at expected areas of our contribution, we can, these are, by the way, just examples. But for example, geothermal power generation, urban railroads, disaster prevention infrastructure, water supply, and also the early warning system, intercity collaboration, human resource development. Those are the areas in which we have had considerable experience and expertise. And so with our new climate finance, we would very much like to promote these areas. By the way, just to give you one idea, geothermal power generation, in Kenya, we have made considerable contributions to geothermal power plants in Kenya. And I don't remember the exact English word for this, but there is a kind of geographical feature which expands from Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and towards further south. And in this particular geographical structure, it's a kind of valley. I'm not sure how it's called in English, but it's a kind of valley. And all along this particular valley, you have a lot of potential for geothermal power generation. So those are the areas that we can explore further. And this is to make contributions to our G7 agreement in Elmau back in June. Was it June? Back in June this year. As you might remember, the Elmau Summit Declaration document does have an attachment, and one of them is, renewable energy in Africa. So geothermal projects in Africa will be a part of that. And also, early warning system is something that France has proposed, what is called CRUISE. I don't remember precisely what that stands for, but it's an initiative, early warning initiative, and our efforts will be in line with the initiative. So those are the things that we are planning to do. Now, on innovation, my colleague from METI, Mr. Mitsumata, will be giving you some explanations.
Thank you. Just regarding the innovation, looking ahead of his attendance to the COP21, this morning Prime Minister Abe showed strong will that the key to simultaneously achieve tackling climate change and economic growth is the development of innovative technology, and that Japan will formulate the energy and environment innovation strategy to reinforce the development of innovative technologies in energy and environment by the next spring. The contents of the strategy will be considered from now. but it is necessary for the relevant governmental agencies to collaboratively proceed with the consideration process with the input from the leaders and experts from private and academic sectors. It will be considered under the Committee on Science, Technology, and Innovation under the government. And also, Japan will promote transferring of advanced low-carbon technologies through the joint crediting mechanism, etc. That is about the innovation part of the Actions for Cool Earth version 2.
Thank you very much. And also, my colleague from Environment will talk about JCM.
Thank you, Ambassador Uike. As Ambassador said earlier, Japan is an advocate of market mechanisms as a means of effective emission reductions on a global scale. We'd like to fully utilize Japan's advanced low-carbon technologies, including energy efficiency and renewable and so on. We established a so-called joint crediting mechanism for that purpose. We already have 16 partner countries, including Asian, African, and Latin American countries. You can find in front of you as one sheet of paper. This is a list of the feasibility studies under the JCM scheme. I'd like to emphasize that it is the emission reduction efforts should be made not only by the national governments, but also various stakeholders, including local governments. So some of these projects will be implemented by through the city-to-city cooperation. In this case, Japanese major cities and cities of other countries, such as Yokohama, Osaka, and Kawasaki cities, and for instance, Surabaya or Bandung cities in Indonesia. This is just feasibility studies, but beyond feasibility studies, we already have a registered project in some countries. Japan will further promote this scheme to achieve the real reduction in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your patience. If you have any questions, please.
Yes. Okay. Now we'd like to open the floor for questions. We will receive questions from the foreign press, but one question at a time, please. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and if you are selected, please use a microphone and identify your name and affiliation before you ask your question. So, yes.
Ambassador, my name is Patrick Walter with German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine. I'm just wondering, talking about the proposal today or the commitment today, you say Japan commits to 1.3 trillion of public and private climate financing. I'm just wondering, how can the government of Japan commit for private money in that respect? Can you please explain it? Are these investments counted in this sum, or how does it fit together?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Shall I? Okay, perhaps one by one is easy for us. So, okay. Your question is a very good question, and that's a question that we're asking ourselves as well. You know, as you might be aware, in October, OECD came up with a report saying that aggregate number of the climate finance from developed countries to developing countries in the year 2014 is $61.8 billion. In the process of that calculation, the developed countries had some discussions about how to count the private capital. Now, if a particular private capital is mobilized as a result of government action, that should be included in this calculation. In our case, at the time of OECD report, I think what we did was the most conservative methodology. We counted only the private capital, which is a co-finance of JBIC loans. JBIC, you are pretty aware of JBIC. Japan International Corporation, International Bank, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Sorry, JBIC. They they extend usually loans and to a particular project. At that time, their loans are usually accompanied by a private portion. It's a co-finance, and we counted only that part. So that's why this was very strongly linked to government money, and it's easier for us to make commitments. Now, beyond that, we haven't done it yet, but there should be a way to count some private capital in this context. As you know, the President Obama invited some major CEOs, the U.S. companies, to White House. I think they have done it twice before, and on one occasion, finance institutions were invited, and those finance institutions invited made a collective announcement that they're going to provide such and such amount of money. So this is not strictly leveraged by the public money, but nonetheless, this announcement came as a result of government initiative. So we should be able to count something like that as well. So as you know, we cannot determine the private capital. We cannot ask them to invest. But nevertheless, there's a way to leverage the private capital with the public money.
Can you tell us the 1.3 trillion, how much do you expect will be true public money and how much do you expect will be true private money?
At the moment, we are not planning to disclose that information. We made our own predictions on certain assumptions. But our Prime Minister's pledge is based on those estimates. It's not coming from nowhere. We have, Japanese, we are very meticulous about our methodologies. So this number is a good number, basis of the good estimate. Nevertheless, this is 5 years later. So we are planning to explain the details of our estimates at this stage. I'm sorry for that, but if this is next year, we could probably do it. But this is 5 years later. So thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman over there. 一番向こうの
Thank you. Robin Harding with the Financial Times. Could you tell me, Mr. Ambassador, do you feel you go to these talks with a lot of room to negotiate, or will you be going to present a fairly fixed Japanese position and then see what happens? Thank you.
Well, everybody in this type of negotiations would start with a very strong conservative position and make concessions as the discussions go on. At the moment, I think most of the countries or the groups of countries have stated their positions without indicating much room for compromise. That is where we are at the moment. So we will, of course, go to Paris with very conservative, or perhaps conservative may not be the right word, our own position. But as the negotiations go on, of course, we can go for compromises. So we don't, I think we want to be there with certain constructive spirit and flexibility. But nevertheless, what we want to achieve in this context is very clear, and it reflects what we have been doing throughout this year, not just for this negotiation.
Other questions? Irene-san.
Elaine Kurtenbach, Associated Press. I just want to clarify something about the 1.3 trillion, which is that I assume that it is not specifically connected with these feasibility studies and these projects. And the other question is, how likely do you think it is that you'll be able to meet the $100 billion goal? According to what the French ambassador said yesterday, you're still at a minimum like 23 billion away from that. So putting everything together.
Okay. The first question is a bit difficult to answer, but as I said before, we have a very we studied a lot of possibilities. So this number is based on a very solid ground. But nevertheless, since this is 5 years later, obviously many of the projects have not reached the stage of its implementation or even planning. We have seen some potentials in some areas, and we counted those potentials as possible projects. So your question is a bit difficult to answer, but some of them are based on feasibility studies, and they will be implemented in a matter of 1 or 2 years. Some of them are still a potential. So there are some different groups of projects. The second point is a very political issue, and perhaps we're not here to give you a prediction. France is doing that work as a chair, so I want to leave that to France. But I think our contribution, judging from the fact that some of the European countries, the major ones, have already made commitments, and some MDBs have already made considerable commitments, and private capital is increasing at a certain pace. Taking all of these into account, together with our contribution, I cannot say we can reach the point, but at the same time, we are, I think, on the right track there. And I very much hope that our contributions will be a big step forward in that bigger context. And I'm sure that it will be a very big contribution in the context.
Any other questions? Yes, gentleman in the front seat.
Thank you very much. Hiroshi Hiyama from AFP. Just to clarify this 1.3 trillion yen figure, for clarification, I see in 2020 the money is going to be released. If that's the case, does this mean Japan is pledging to give 1.33 trillion yen over the next 5 years, or is it just this year alone? This money is slated for this year. So that's one question. And then why is it 20? Why does Japan wait until 2020? Is there anything planned for 2016, 2017? If there's nothing in 2016, 2017, 2018, etc., isn't it a downgrade from the current level, which is 1 trillion yen on average in the past two years, 2013 and 2014? So I just wanted to see how we should understand this figure.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, the answer to your first question is very simple. It's our COP agreement. The COP decision in Cancun, the COP16 decision, clearly says that developed countries are going to extend public finance from private and public sources, amounting to $100 billion in the year 2020. So that's a decision. This is an agreement. So our commitment is for the year 2020 because this is a part of that commitment. Nothing more than that, or nothing less than that. So that's the reason why we have this year in particular. This is a number only for that year. Now, whether we will have a decrease or increase in the years before that. Well, I don't think we're going to have, very naturally we have some fluctuations, but I don't think in general the climate finance is decreasing. It's just that we are not asked to make commitments for those years. For 16, 17, 18, 19, we were not asked to make commitments. We were asked to make commitments only for the year 2020 by the COP decision in Cancun. That's why.
Follow up? Yes.
So 1.3 trillion yen, it comes on top of 2 trillion yen that Japan has already provided. So that's why this is an upgrade. Is that, am I correct to understand that?
Yes, the 2 billion that 20 billion that you is 20. Yeah, 20 billion is for the years 2013 and 14, and that's already done. Yes. So it's outside of our considerations. What we are talking about is the climate finance in the 2020. So yeah, as you said, this is additional, but 5 years later. Yeah.
Any other questions? Ning-san.
Martin Kölling with the German financial daily Handelsblatt. I would like to know whether you, how much pressure or skepticism you expect to receive for your proposals, for your climate, for CO2 emission proposals.
Oh.
I understand from many private experts that they don't think that your goals are realistic.
Okay, so it's not this one, but our CO2 emission pledges. Okay, on that one, yes, we have heard some NGOs and we have heard some people saying that our reduction rate is small in comparison to others like European Union, who is talking about 40% reduction from the current level. Now, on that one, I always argue this way. If you look at the achievements as a result of the efforts that we specified in our NDC, our achievements will be at least as good, and in some cases better than other developed countries. Like, for example, one indicator to that is GDP, greenhouse gas emission per GDP in the year 2030. This is projection in the year 2030. Our figure will be the best among the EU altogether, and the United States, Canada, and all the other developed countries. It is true that some countries in the European Union will have better numbers, like UK. They will have better numbers than us. But if you take EU altogether, our number will be the best. And for the sake of fairness, let me quote another figure: greenhouse gas emissions per population, per person. On that, we are not as good as the EU number. We are slightly, we are a bit less than European community altogether. But nevertheless, at least we can say that our numbers are as ambitious in general, and then our number on the particular indicator is better than the US or better than other developed countries. So if you look at the achievements that we're going to have as a result of our commitments, our efforts are very much substantial and at least as ambitious. That's what we believe. Now, some people are saying that the reference year that we quoted, the 2013, is not in line with the general thinking. But at the same time, we want to establish our own commitments on the basis of the realities which came to the reality after the great earthquake and tsunami in eastern Japan region. So we chose that year. But at the same time, we also talked about the year 2005 as reference. And in fact, the number is almost the same. It's minus 26% from the 13 level, but minus 25.4% from the year 2005 level. It's almost the same. So there's no ill intention behind all of this. So in short, we are one of the most energy efficient countries in the world already. Our energy efficiency, for example, is 35% better than the G7 average. So even if you think that the reduction number is smaller than others, if you look at the achievements as a result of those efforts, our commitments is a very ambitious one. That's the point that I always explain when I encounter a criticism like that.
Since our time is running out, I'd like to receive the one final question from the lady.
Just going back, Saki Watanabe from Bloomberg News. Going back to the 1.3 trillion yen help or support from both private and public sectors. So you mentioned that Japan is not asked to make commitment between 2016 and 19. Does that mean Japan doesn't plan to pledge any money during that period at all, or is that up to negotiation later?
A good question. That's a very contentious point, because some developing countries are asking for midterm target in this context, but that has not been agreed. So what was agreed in this context of climate change negotiations is only $100 billion for that particular year. That's why we are doing it. Whether we are planning, or perhaps whether we are intending to make any midterm commitments or not, depends on negotiations. We are in the middle of negotiations, so we have to honor what we committed in the context of negotiations. But all the other points are up to negotiations.
Okay. Well, now I'd like to close today's briefing session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.